All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started, y'all. And as always, I've got a lot of questions that you submitted, kind of typed out, but we'll have some question answered towards the end. So we'll just get through me and Michelle just kind of discussing some different points. And at the end, we'll open it up for questions and we'll spend as much time as Michelle will give with us. Um, so I'm going to do just a little bit of an introduction. So first of all, I want to say thank y'all for being here because I love these live talks, and I know that it's a sacrifice to set aside some time on a Saturday to be here for this, but your contribution matters, and I really, really appreciate it. There's a ton of people that want to be here, and they can't because of life situations, but I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart just for being here, and it's great seeing you guys because I miss you. I really do. So I want to welcome Michelle because we had a great conversation, I think it was like a month and a half ago or something along those lines, where she graciously agreed to give us some time, and she's super busy. So I'm very thankful for that. The intention today is to motivate, inspire, heal with Michelle's story, her journey, her insights. I think I told Michelle that we did a poll not too long ago in our community. It was an anonymous poll. And we asked what percentage animal foods to plant foods based on eyeball and volume do you consume? And the community average is about 68% animal foods to plant foods. So a lot of us lean towards animal foods with some starch and some fruit and a little bit of veggies. Many of us are very balanced, and we even have a couple of vegetarian vegans that are very strategic with their supplementation, like Chandler here. And I'm really thankful that he always shows up to these things, no matter what the topic is. So today, what I want is for Michelle to share her perspective, and regardless of where you fall on the spectrum, take this information, add it to your cumulative wisdom, and see where you might want to make some changes or do some experiments. And by the way, I don't know if you saw it, we're going to do October is going to be an animal-based month. So we will do an animal-based progression in October, and there's more details in the event that we just put in there. So without further ado, let me just introduce Michelle real quick. She is a registered dietitian, licensed dietitian. She's got 11 years of experience working in the field. While practicing in the hospital setting, she saw this disconnect between the nutrition guidelines that she's required to teach and the declining health of the patients that she was working with and that she saw there. So, and then herself, she has I just finished reading her book yesterday, like her personal story. I was in tears literally when I read the first part of it with her story. So she had some health issues that had set her on this path, like many of us. Today, she looks, feels, and performs great. She's happier. She's an endurance athlete. She's competed in, I think you said 12 marathons, ultra marathons. I think you won a few that I had written down. The Tunnel Hill, which was a 50-mile race. The Strawberry Fields 100K, which was covering 62 miles in 10 hours. Can't even believe that. And she is the author of the book, The Dietitian's Dilemma. So, Michelle, thank you so much for being here with us today. Oh, you're muted. I muted you. Sorry. I muted everybody. Are you unmuted?
Okay, now I'm
Okay,
unmuted. There we go.
yeah.
No,
Sorry
thank
about
you
that.
so much for having me. And I very much appreciate not only the introduction, but just I think we could do a lot better in the entire health sphere if everybody was just open. Like, let's talk about things that let's share experience, let's share the science. And like you said, what can we potentially take away? Because,
Yeah.
one thing I think has benefited me, especially recently in my career, is that I'm not afraid to be wrong. I'm not afraid to experiment, and I'm not afraid to grow and evolve. So
Yeah, I got that from your book. I was expecting it to be a super hardcore animal-based, like Paul Saladino attitude. And it was a very compassionate, very open, very flexible way of doing things. So I really did
thank
enjoy
you.
it. So first question, if you don't mind, since I just finished reading this yesterday, can you just tell us your personal story, what got you to where you are today? To me, it was kind of heartbreaking. I know that we've all
Yeah.
been through something very similar, but if there's a spectrum and we're on the spectrum, you were at like the extreme end of the spectrum. So
I was, yeah. Oh, I stuck my person on my ear. So that's why. Hey, there you go. That's why. Yeah, I was like, why is this bothering me? Yeah, so my health journey really begins when I was 12 years old. When I was 12 years old, I was diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. I was 5 feet tall and about 57 and a half pounds. So I was literally, there's pictures of emaciation, and as an adult, I've had people ask me, like, how did your parents not know? How did they miss this? And I just, I kind of come back to, we didn't have camera phones. We didn't have social media. My mom was diagnosed bipolar. So she unfortunately was absent. She would often lock herself in a room for several days. Severe depression, severe mania was really not available. And so my father, I have 3 older sisters, was working a lot, trying just to support us. And so I think it just kind of went, it happened quickly too. It wasn't like it was a period of years. It was a period of several months. I starved myself pretty significantly. And it wasn't until I was actually walking around at school. I literally remember walking in 7th grade to my next class and just feeling like, oh, I feel like I'm going to throw up. And then I blacked out. And that's the last thing I remember. I woke up in the hospital with a blood glucose of 24. And of course, they told me that. I didn't know what that meant as an 11-year-old, but now as a health professional, I mean, that can kill you. That can put you in a coma and you can die. So I was immediately, put into an inpatient 60-day treatment for anorexia. They put me on a 24-hour tube feeding system. And if you're not familiar with tube feeding systems, the number one ingredients of the solution are maltodextrin, high fructose corn syrup, soy protein isolate, very highly inflammatory. But I was just told hey, what, I'm sorry, this is your new lot in life. You are going to struggle with food for your entire life. You're going to struggle with anxiety your entire life. You're going to have to become this high functioning person with an eating disorder. I was also, later found out the relapse rate for eating disorders is about 50%. 20% of people who die from eating disorders actually take their own life. It's a pretty horrible, anyone who's dealt with that, it's pretty gnarly. I did become weight restored, meaning I gained weight, but they were accurate. I struggled. I was put on 7 different medications too, as a 11, 12-year-old, anxiety, depression, severe gastrointestinal issues. I was immediately, made to follow this standard American diet. I was taught that all foods fit, we have to be able to eat, sugar foods. We have to eat whole grains. And yeah, through my early adolescence. Yes. And through my early adolescence, my, weight kind of waxed and waned. But I wanted to become a dietitian. I thought maybe if I can understand nutrition, maybe I'll actually be able to help myself, help other people. I did gain enough weight into where I was able to become an athlete. But, when I got into the dietetic program, so to become a dietitian, 4-year degree at university, you apply to an internship, got into an internship. There were just things that didn't make sense. For example, I'll never forget walking into the room as someone who had type 2 diabetes. And our preceptor said, okay, so we're going to teach them how to eat 75 grams of carbohydrates for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I was like, wait, I thought their blood sugar was high. Oh, well, it is. Well, maybe they should eat less carbohydrates. Oh, no, we're going to teach them to eat the exact same amount so they can dose their insulin. And so it was, I was like, that doesn't really make sense. And then I remember going to the ICU and I flipped over the tube feeding. I'm like, oh my God, look at this. These are the same ingredients I was fed when I was 12. And I mean, that was 12 years later. And now it's, 25 plus years later, and they're still the same. There are better tube feeding formulas available now. But, I worked in the clinic for 11 years and we got them covered by insurance twice. So, they're not, and if you can't pay out of pocket, it's about $1,100 a day if you want the better formulas. So most formulas, the default formula is still high fructose corn syrup and, all the other pretty gnarly ingredients. So I just asked questions. I just said hey, is this the best way to feed somebody? Because if you're getting a nasogastric tube, that means you can't eat because they want you to obviously be able to eat if you can. And I was kind of pegged as this difficult dietetic student. And I ended up getting a job and I saw just this revolving door of people continuing, I'd see a patient with diabetes. I'd recommend the nutrition guidelines. I was often told people just aren't doing what they tell it, what we tell them. They're not eating enough fruits and vegetables. They're eating too much junk food. And most of the time my patients were really trying to follow the guidelines. Yep. And so at the same time, I also had an astronomical patient load to where I felt like I wasn't even able to talk to somebody for more than 2 or 3 minutes, because as soon as you talk to a patient, you also have to chart a whole bunch. So I brought this concern up to my clinical director and she was just like, hey, are you still charting? And I was like, well, yeah. And that's not the problem. The problem is I'm not having enough time. She's like, oh, it's fine. As long as you're doing, basically as long as you're getting reimbursed by insurance, don't worry about actually helping anybody. So I struggled with this message, but it wasn't really until 2019. I was trying to qualify for the Olympic trials in the marathon. So to do that, at that time, you had to run under 2 hours and 48 minutes. At the time, I'd run 2 hours and 54 minutes. And so I was training quite a bit. I was training a lot. I was following, and had followed most of my life that very traditional high carb diet, eating about 350 grams of carbohydrates a day, and mostly whole food carbohydrates. I did have some like granola bars and cookies and stuff, but mostly like oatmeal and whole wheat bread and all this stuff. And I noticed just strangely my body started to hurt. And I know we all have our health journeys, and it's just I thought like, oh, maybe my iron's low, maybe I didn't sleep well. But all my lab results came back, and I'd go on runs and I'd break out in a cold sweat. I tried to run a half marathon in August of 2019, and I was 2 miles from the finish, and I had to drop out. I was, as things were getting like fuzzy and black, and I kind of my come to Jesus moment, I like to say, was I literally, was no longer able to run more than a couple miles without getting these cold sweats and vomiting. Oh, and I'd also reached out to some sports dietitians, and they told me I needed to eat more carbohydrates, more sugar. And so I tried that. And as you can imagine, things went from bad to worse. I also noticed my anxiety during that time went from bad to panic attacks. I started to have suicidal ideation for the first time in over a decade. And I went to the hospital. I also covered oncology in the ICU at that time. And we just had a patient that was relatively young pass away, which sucks. That happens in oncology. And so just having a rough day, came home, fell asleep early, and I woke up and it just felt like my body was on fire. And I just didn't know what to do. Like I was out of answers, and I felt like the medical community had failed me. I had eaten as healthy as I was told. I had, at that point, I'm on prescription strength, some pain medication is not working. I had tried alcohol, I had tried weed, I had tried all kinds of things. And so I just standing in my living room, like, what do I do? And so at 3 a.m, I drove to 7-Eleven. I got 30 pounds of ice, put it in the bathtub, taking an ice bath, crying. And that's when I'm married. My wife came in and said, hey, you know what? I think it's time to do something different. I think you got to do something different. And I was just like, yeah, my running days are done. I'm never running again. This is stupid. Like, I'm 36. I'm too old. And if you had told me like that moment, freezing my ass off and 3 a.m. is going to be the turning point of my life, I would have told you you're nuts. So the next day just decided like, look, I kind of intuitively know that eating all these carbohydrates was not making me feel well, but I don't think I fully appreciated or understood the vast implications of even whole grains. I did not know. So I just decided I was going to follow a ketogenic diet for a little while, see if that helped my body, which kind of led me down, you start to research, and found the carnivore diet. And I was like, this is nuts. Like, I can get behind meat, all meat. But the more I researched it, the more I started to really dive into bioavailability. And that was not a concept that was taught to me as a dietitian. Mm-hmm. I was not taught that certain foods, we know like, oh, you eat animal protein, it's more bioavailable, more digestible. But I was not taught that certain vitamins and minerals are just absolutely non-existent in the plant kingdom. For example, like I'd always struggled with, acne and other things. I'm probably, now we know 45% of people cannot convert that carotenoid vitamin A, the vitamin A you find in like sweet potatoes and carrots, cannot actually convert it to a usable form, the form that we find in like liver and some animal products. Same thing with vitamin K2. And I also struggled with anemia throughout my whole life. And I was just thought like, oh, it's just because I'm running. But I was taking in so much phytic acid. In our American diets, phytic acid is so high in grains. It's in oatmeal, it's in rice, it's in beans, it's in nuts. And all, I'm eating all this phytic acid. My body, it will bind to iron and calcium and all kinds of things. So I decided for 30 days, you know what, I'm just going to eat meat and fat. And, I told my wife, and she was having none of it. This is eating disorder. This is terrible. We fought about it. She cried. I felt terrible. But I just had this intuition. And I think it was more, I just believed that the protein might help me not hurt so bad. Like my muscles are destroyed. I need. So she finally was like, whatever, you're an adult, do it. You're going to quit. And, of course, the first few days of switching from a very high carbohydrate to low carbohydrate diet, your body goes through some of that adaptation. So it was pretty difficult. But after that, I tell you, I remember like a week and a half in, like my body didn't hurt anymore. And I just, at first it's like, oh, well, it's just because I'm not running. But then 3 weeks in, I will never forget, I came home from work and my wife was literally sitting there on the couch and I said, hey, I need you to come here. And, you know, you never want to hear that if you're married or you have a partner, because it's like, who died? What did I do? You know? And I'm like, all right. And she took my hand and was like, I don't know if I like the way you're eating, but this is the best your anxiety has been in the 11 years that I've known you.
That's great. Yeah.
And I like, we both were like, what is going on? So that's when, you know, we're both, she's a scientist. We have access to all the clinical trials. You know, you may, if you work at a hospital or whatever, they have memberships where you can access everything. Some, you know, if you don't, you often have to pay for more than just the abstract. And I was shocked. I was blown away. And I was angry at how many, we have over 1,000 clinical trials on ketogenic diets. Like I was told, oh, it's just for epilepsy. It's like, we have so much on type 2 diabetes and low carbohydrate diets, and even brain chemistry and neurochemistry when you reduce the carbohydrates in your diet. And so, of course, you know, I very eagerly went to my hospital with all these printed out things. It was like, I can change how we teach. I was like, I want to work with the diabetics. And I was immediately like, no, you're not doing that. You have to teach the guidelines. So yeah, wrapping up. I just, so I left healthcare, wrote a book, started running again. Now I don't run 26 miles. I run races more than 26 miles. I became an ultra marathon. So my health went from completely crapped out, you know, to being able to not only run again, but, you know, my mental health obviously is significantly better.
Yeah. And that's great that the changes you experienced were relatively fast, you know, so that you felt intuitively like, hey, this something's working in a good direction for me here.
Absolutely.
What year, do you remember what year it was that you started to look into that? Because I remember when Kresser and Saladino and them came on the scene, and it did sound very bizarre. Like I mean, I'm all about animal foods and meat, but I was just like, carnivore, that seems kind of extreme. If they would have called it animal based back then, it might have sounded a little bit more palatable, you know, but carnivore but then when you look into it, like, but anyway, when was that you
it was October 2019. So I believe they'd been on the scene for a minute. But I also, you know, now I do think the carnivore diet, and you've read my book, like is a very, really helpful tool for many people. I think we need to get to a point to where we remove everything that's potentially allergenic, and we just got our bodies, especially in our, you know, environment with all the foods we eat, the stress we have. We need an opportunity just to absorb vitamins, minerals, get some saturated fats. But I do think most people, especially if you're metabolically healthy, are able to tolerate small amounts of plant foods. And that, I mean, that has been my life story. That's what's been really successful. That's what's been successful for most people that I work with, is kind of starting with this foundation of how can we get the most bang for our buck, bioavailable nutrition. And then from there, how can we add things that we enjoy, things that potentially fuel our bodies, and, you know, and also to your goals. Obviously, my goal as an ultra runner is different than if I'm working with someone with type 2 diabetes. So
right. And then also just always paying attention to how things make you feel so that you can customize your way of doing things, you know, because all of us are going to tolerate different plant foods to different degrees and things like that.
Absolutely.
Well, I did pick up on in your book and just in our conversation that the mental illness, or maybe we could even say things like anxiety, depression, sadness, stress, those all seem to be something that you're very passionate about. Could you speak a little bit about the relation of diet and mental illness, or the things that we just mentioned there? Because it sounds like you feel there's a really strong nutritional component. Am I right?
I do. And I think that, you know, if anybody's interested, you know, in Googling any podcast by Dr. Georgia Ede or Dr. Chris Palmer, it would be really helpful. You know, I've leaned on them both. I've met Chris in person for their research on mental health, because I knew my anxiety got better quickly, but I didn't know why. And, you know, there's certainly some different theories on that. We know simply just balancing your blood sugar will improve anxiety. And what I mean by that, you know, if you start your day with a bowl of cereal, blood sugar spikes, insulin, you crash. You know, you start with, then you have a coffee and toast. So most of America is riding this blood sugar roller coaster all day. And that certainly can contribute to anxiety. But there were a couple of other things that I found really interesting that I didn't necessarily know or fully appreciate. And the first one being that the brain absolutely requires certain vitamins in their very absorbable form to function, to have enough neurotransmitters to be able to, you know, to have synapses, just for your brain to work, for you to be able to feel joy or to feel happy. So those are obviously highly prevalent in animal-based foods, so meat and eggs. And as we've kind of continued as a society, unfortunately, we're kind of in a time right now where there's a lot of propaganda around removing meat. Meat is bad. You don't need as much meat. On the second hand, something really interesting, if you or somebody you know has been dealing with like depression, like a pretty severe bipolar disorder, depression, mental illness, they're actually thinking that it could be similar to epilepsy in that your brain just doesn't utilize glucose well. And what I mean by that is we didn't used to think the brain actually had like insulin receptors, actually used insulin, but it does. We know that now. So if you think about it, it's like, for example, like if somebody goes in their doctor, they're dealing with depression, they get all their lab work done, everything comes back fine. So their doctor gives them an antidepressant. They still feel terrible. And they're just like, well, maybe I'm just meant to be depressed. You know, my life sucks, whatever. So that person didn't do anything wrong. Like babies that are born with epilepsy, it's not like they're babies. Toddlers. They didn't do anything. It's not like you had a terrible diet or you had some trauma or something. There was nothing that really caused this. It's just that some people may actually be born with their brain's inability to utilize glucose well. And so when that happens, so like for babies that have epilepsy, if they just have normal breast milk or formula, they can actually have seizures because it has some carbohydrates. You all of a sudden put them on a ketogenic, so a very low carbohydrate, very high fat, higher protein formula, they do fine. They stop seizing. So what we're seeing in mental health, and Dr. Palmer is doing clinical trials on this right now, but what we've seen is that for some people, when they go on these really low carb diets, their brain actually starts to function. Because if your brain's not functioning, you can have severe signs. You can have depression. You can have, some weight gain. You can start visual or audio hallucinations. So that's why and to me, that was fascinating. No one had ever shared with me that I might just have a metabolic abnormality in my brain. Like, is that why now that you're not taking in all those carbohydrates? Because I noticed right away, if I take in a lot of carbohydrates, man, immediately my mood is just shifted.
Yeah.
So that's
absolutely.
a possibility. And then there's one other,
oh,
sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I see that with my clients too.
Yeah. Well, and there's one other thing that we also know that there's neurotransmitters and like everybody, even if you don't have a metabolic abnormality in the brain, most people recognize like dopamine, like, yay, I feel really good. They know that neurotransmitter dopamine, but glutamate and GABA are two really important neurotransmitters. And we know now that certain things can actually shift that glutamate GABA balance. Like your brain wants to keep glutamate and GABA like as legit as possible. But certain like major stresses and things can actually cause glutamate in your brain to go up to like 100 times the normal level. And we see this level in suicide victims, people severely depressed, all kinds of stuff. You know what else does that is processed food. They're seeing that shift the levels in your brain. So now we have processed food companies. I'm thinking like Oreos, ice cream, all this crap. You eat that, what happens? You get a blood sugar rush. So you feel like, wow, you feel euphoric. You often get a dopamine response. So you feel really good. But at the same time, it's shifting your brain. You're shifting that glutamate, which the problem with shifting glutamate really high, I know I'm going to use some big words, but I'll explain this, is it actually suppresses neuroplasticity. And what does neuroplasticity do? Neuroplasticity is really important to deal with stress and to learn new information. So if you're, let's say, you're struggling with depression, you're dealing with an addiction, you're trying to change job, you're already dealing with life stress, as all of us are. We eat these processed foods, they mess up our brain, we can't cope with stress. So it's just this like crazy cycle. So when you shift how you eat, when you're eating foods that are satiating, that are full of vitamins and minerals and saturated fat is, very good for us. It's been demonized over and over and over and again. And that's just silly. Mental health improves dramatically.
Yeah. And it sounds like, so if I'm hearing you right, there's a component and if we could try to break this down to some practical usage tips for all of us, it would be, there's a blood sugar handling component, right? So when you stabilize your blood sugar, eating the appropriate foods, and you train your body to be metabolically flexible, that can improve your mood and your stress and your anxiety levels. But there's also a nutritional component. So you need to feed your brain and your body the right things. And then also there's the anti-nutritional component that probably plays a role in it too, which is, I guess, what you're seeing maybe with the grains and the processed foods. Does that sound about right?
That's correct. And, if people choose and want to eat carbohydrates, like I think our upper tolerance for carbohydrates is about 40 grams per meal, per Dr. Lyons, and Americans eat about 350 grams a day. So, and that, I think that's honestly low. I think people probably eat and take in, I'd say take in, because a lot of people drink carbohydrates through sodas and other things. So what we really want to do in order to balance our blood sugar is to focus on foods that are higher in protein and high in fat. And we want to keep carbohydrates relatively low. Humans need zero carbohydrates to live and thrive. And so how I coach people is like, we want to find out what your goals are, what your health is. And then, building once again, that foundation, making sure if you get protein and fat at every meal, you're going to help balance your blood sugar. And then if you're going to have some carbohydrates, what are we going to do that around? Are you active? Are you just like, if you're a very healthy, metabolically healthy person, there's probably no reason you can't have 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrates. You just maybe spread it out. But if you're not, which we know statistically 93% of the US is metabolically unhealthy, probably need an easy tiger on the carbohydrates, going as low as 25 grams or less.
Well, I love that. And that kind of segues into, I was really excited when I read your book, when you got into the protein section and the importance of protein with aging and sarcopenia. First of all, can you just explain a little bit about that, like the importance of protein and muscle mass for functionality and for health as we age? Because we actually just got done talking about this not too long ago, and it's great to have another person kind of confirm this info.
Well, when you're young, you can get away. When you're young, your ability to utilize and synthesize protein is really high. And when I say young, I would say anybody like even in our early 20s. We're usually able with our hormones, whether you're male or female, you can, for lack of a better term, eat a lot of crap and still be okay, especially if you're an active person. Mm-hmm. But as we age, certainly after 30, the body starts utilizing protein less effectively. So it is more important to get more protein and the more protein that your body can use and absorb. And we know, like on a scale, like animal proteins, they vastly better than plant proteins. They have all the nutrition and they don't have any of the like you said, the anti-nutrients. They don't have any lectins or oxalates or gluten or anything like that. Also, the recommendations are bad. Our RDA recommendations are stupid. I mean, they're literally made for 18-year-old healthy males so they don't die. Like just to keep this very healthy human alive, bare minimum. And I'm telling you that working in the hospital, most of the elderly people I saw didn't even get that bare minimum, and this is not untypical that people will start their day with some toast and tea or a bowl of cereal. For lunch, it's, a little plain spaghetti, maybe some soup. For dinner, I'm going to have a, pizza or something. You can get to the end of the day and have, less than 40 grams of protein. A lot of times elderly individuals are only eating, twice a day. So what I saw in the hospital setting is sarcopenia is just muscle wasting. Mm-hmm. And I saw people that were in their 30s and 40s that were so overly fat, but under muscled, they literally couldn't walk this, several steps to the bathroom. And you may see this in some of your grandparents, either super thin and wiry or just so much excess weight. And these are the people that healthcare, especially the people that have excess weight, like, oh, you need to move more. You need to try to move. You need to eat less. It's like, no, you don't need to eat less. You need to eat more protein. Yeah. And yes, you do. Ideally, you need to stress your muscles to some degree. That's very important. But telling people to eat less protein, in my opinion, in my experience, especially an old person, like, oh, you should eat less, meat, which is, obviously I'm an animal-based person, but then they say, okay, well, instead of having, turkey and mashed potatoes, I'll just have mashed potatoes and toast. They tend to replace them with more higher carbohydrate foods. Yeah. So that's a big problem.
The advice they're getting, well, I mean, everyone is less protein as you age. And then, of course, we get into the whole, animal meats are bad for health and contribute, to climate change and things like that. But what are your recommendations as far as protein goes? Like, what do you recommend? Like, is there a daily amount or a per meal amount? And do you recommend any kind of training, resistance versus cardio or?
Yeah, that's a great question. For protein synthesis, we want to get enough. A really important amino acid is leucine. You really want to get enough leucine. And so I think that is extra important as you age. And so to do that, we tend to need to get about between 28 and 35 grams of protein minimum per meal, ideally 3 times per day. And I know some people like to only eat once or twice. Ideally, for protein synthesis, you are having 3 times per day. Mm-hmm. And that's another, issue for, and that may sound like a lot, like, oh my God, 20, that's 4 ounces of beef. That's 1 scoop of whey protein. That's a cup and a half of Greek yogurt. That's, when you're focusing on the more animal proteins, And that's another problem if you are getting the plant proteins. If you can get enough leucine through quinoa or potatoes, but you'd have to eat, over 1,000 calories of those. So that's just another thing to consider. If you are somebody who really wants to get everything from plants, you just are going to have to take in a lot more calories, which for some people, once again, if you're young and metabolically healthy, that might not be an issue. But if you're older and obese, and once again, that's much of our population.
So
you're
30,
really
30, 30 grams of protein per sitting or more. And then,
Yep.
And then do you have a daily total protein intake that you recommend?
I don't necessarily throw out a daily total. I think, I think a good kind of baseline is about a gram per pound, So protein is one of those things that is very satiating too. Most of us like listening here have probably, eaten a cookie or eaten some chips or like plowed through a whole bag of chips. Like it's very easy to overeat carbohydrates, especially those more processed carbohydrates. It is very difficult to eat a steak and then be like, I want another steak. Like usually it's like, oh, that's good. Like I'm done. Like the body, the feedback mechanism for protein, it works very well in the brain. So and protein, the myth that too much protein is bad for your kidneys, that's a total myth. Even the, American Kidney Association has come back and said like, look, we used to restrict protein for people with kidney failure. And unfortunately it didn't reduce all-cause mortality. They ended up dying of something else, usually malnutrition. Especially if you're a healthy human, enough protein is like, I would rather people lean on the side of a little more than a little less, right? Like I'm 5'7", I'm a runner, I'm about 120 pounds. So I'm getting probably 130 plus a day. So I'm going a little over that. Right. And there's even studies that if you go over, you're getting more protein per se than you need. Like you go over your calorie expenditure, you're not going to be gaining fat from protein.
Yeah. So basically just getting decent amounts of pops of protein when you eat. Probably, I think a lot of us are, like you mentioned, we get really satiated from being protein centric. And so then we're trying to balance this idea of eating often enough to get the nutrition that you need, even though you're satiated and you don't necessarily feel like eating that often. Yeah. And then also, a lot of us kind of come from a fasting background, and most of us maybe do 2 meals a day or 3 meals per day with no snacking in between. But that's a very easy guideline to follow. I like that. Just making sure, and we've said that before too, like getting at least 30 grams of protein at a sitting, regardless of how many meals in a day that you're eating. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. So I don't think any discussion, since we're kind of in the protein and meat area, maybe we could talk just a little bit about, because Chris had just asked, is it possible to eat too much red meat? I don't think any discussion would be complete without talking about like heart disease and cholesterol.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, well, I was just going to share my blood work. So recently, my blood work, I had triglycerides were 63, my HDL was 83, my total cholesterol was 284, and the calculated LDL was like 185, even though my CRP was really low and my insulin was like a 2. So, am I in trouble with a high total cholesterol?
Yes, you're going to die. That's what your doctor will tell you. It's time to put you on a statin. No, you're not. You're not. And so here's what happened. Obviously, the myth of cholesterol being a bad thing. We even now have like even the nutrition guidelines, which are absolute garbage for the most part, have come back and been like, crap, cholesterol is not bad. They've literally taken that out of the guidelines because they know. But even if you don't know anything about saturated fat, cholesterol, if you look at just two societies that have kept their food relatively the same over time, the Inuit Eskimos and the Maasai. And they eat 80% saturated fat, 80% whale, seal, blubber, and they have zero risk of heart disease. They're actually now, unfortunately, they started to have some heart disease problems because we brought Western food in and they're eating sugar and carb. But when they were just following their diets, right, you could not find heart disease. Same with the Maasai. They're eating, milk, blood, animal meat. That's basically all they eat. And so the question is like, okay, why, doctors used to look in occluded arteries. Like if you look in an artery and you see this plaque formation, it kind of looks like animal fat, and you actually find LDL in the artery. And so the conclusion was like, high LDL must be bad. It's getting stuck in the arteries. But LDL has so many functions in the body, and I talk a lot about in my book about how LDL is actually really important for the immune system. We have lots of studies, and not like, 20 people studies, like 600,000 people studies that showed the lower someone's LDL was, especially as we age, the higher risk they had of having a respiratory infection, a GI infection. And so the question being like, well, crap, like why do we look on the news and see red meat is bad, or red meat causes cancer, red meat causes heart disease? Well, once again, there's something called correlation and causation. So, and then a lot of those studies are based on epidemiology. And what I mean by that is they'll send people food frequency questionnaires and they'll say, how often do you eat these foods? And so someone might fill it out and they say, oh, I eat fries, a hamburger, a soda, weekly. And so, they eat a hamburger. So the study is like, oh, they eat a hamburger. Meat is bad. Meat is linked to, and this person got a disease. Well, they're not looking at what all the other people, there has been 0 studies linking just meat specifically in a low carbohydrate diet base to heart disease or cancer, hence the Anut, hence the MSI. So what's happening and why are we seeing heart disease with people that eat meat or saturated fat? Something has to happen in your artery. This is your artery for LDL to get stuck in there. So what's happening? There has to be some type of inflammation and oxidation. And the number one cause of that is hyperglycemia, is type 2 diabetes. So yes, if you have type 2 diabetes, if you have your blood sugar is 400 and you're eating a lot of meat and fat, that's a really, really dangerous game. That's the combination. Problem. That because now you have inflammation and oxidation, and then LDL gets stuck, and then people are like, "Oh, it's the fat." No, it's the sugar. Get the carbohydrates out. Get that inflammation down. Let your artery actually heal. Then, then we typically, and that's why we see people with type 2 diabetes have a 2 to 4-fold risk of dying of heart disease. We also, our psychiatric population, people with mental illness, like the number one cause of death in those individuals isn't, suicide or what you might think. It's heart disease. Their prescription medications, actually, most of them can elevate blood sugar, which causes weight gain and inflammation in the arteries and can lead to heart disease. So, no,
so you're saying it's not the meat and the fat and the cholesterol that's the problem.
No.
It's probably the inappropriate, maybe unintentional ways that we were eating before that was probably more related to like insulin resistance and high insulin levels than than the meat and the fat. And it's just that those things catch up to you, and it's not the cholesterol.
Exactly. Well, if cholesterol and meat were the problem, like I tell people, like, God, can you take a step back and can we have some common sense? If meat was the problem, if you could really eat too much meat, the human race would not exist. That is what we ate to evolve. We have plenty of evidence through fossils and things that humans ate the megafauna. They ate these really large creatures because they're very nutrient dense. Any type of foliage throughout evolution was very, very, small. Like the fruits and vegetables we have today look nothing like what we had throughout evolution. Those plants had almost no carbohydrates, almost no sugar. They were eaten almost as fillers during times of famine. So the human race evolved being able to eat meat and fat. We even have evidence that our brain size increased. Humans went from being, all fours to bipedal when we started incorporating more animal proteins and cooking as well. So yes, that's a long way of saying you can't overdo it on meat and fat in the context of a metabolically healthy diet, meaning keeping your carbohydrates relatively low.
Yeah, in the context of a real food way of eating, maybe even.
Exactly.
Yep. So, and I love in your book that you mentioned that it seems that LDL seems to have a protective effect as you get older, because what I think we see with a lot of, or at least with a lot of my clients, when we get blood work done, it looks a lot like mine. Like you have a really high HDL, low triglycerides, low inflammation, low insulin, and then you got this LDL that's kind of high. And I've learned not to be scared about it. I get excited about it now, but I think we're just so conditioned to think that total cholesterol and LDL is a problem when potentially it's not, if you've got other markers for good metabolic health.
Absolutely. Like it's all in context. That, heart health is context. So if you go to your doctor and you're, like you said, your triglycerides are good, your A1C is low, your C-reactive protein is low. I'm not worried. I'm not worried. The same with you. Like my LDL has actually been relatively high since I was much younger. Especially, and now that I know what I know, I'm not worried about it at all.
Yeah. Well, so maybe, do you mind if we talk about what your advice is for people that do consume plants? Because a lot of us eat a balanced way of eating, and a lot of us are in constant experiments to see which things we feel best on. Do you have any general guidelines on how to approach consuming plants and and starches and carbs and things?
Well, I definitely think it depends on your goals too. Like if your goal is weight loss, if your goal is performance, it's very different. Because, specifically like if you're going to eat carbohydrates, and we'll just throw out even a whole food carbohydrate, like rice, if you're going to eat something like that, just being aware that, anytime you have carbohydrates, anytime you have a glucose release into your system, you're suppressing your body's ability to burn fat. You're shutting down fatty acid oxidation. So if your goal is weight loss, you definitely don't want to be suppressing fatty acid oxidation. You don't want to be stopping your body from burning fat, And so just being aware of that like, okay, if I'm going to do this, it maybe needs to be around selective times. Am I going to do this, right before I work out, after I work out type of thing? Also, just for tolerance, I do think if you've had some pretty intense autoimmune issues or gut issues, I think it makes the most sense to introduce like one plant food at a time, and sticking with things that are pretty low in anti-nutrients. I wouldn't recommend doing, something really intense. Like, the first thing that comes to mind is like some of the phytic acid, like the whole grains or beans, maybe starting with something pretty mild, like a white rice or a low oxalate vegetable like cucumbers, carrots, things like that, berries, and for some fruits. That would be my best advice.
Maybe some of those bigger, more infamous anti-nutrient based plant groups like nightshades, high oxalate foods. I can't remember. Do you have a list of those things in your book? Because I know you had a lot of information in your PDF handouts.
I don't think I do. That would be really good. I bet, Sally Norton is really, she does specifically oxalates, but with anti-nutrients in general would be kind of a good resource for that. But that's a great question.
Yep. So basically you're saying, focus on the nutritional value of the proteins and things. And if you're experimenting with trying to figure out how much plants and carbs, what are your goals? One of them, if your focus is primarily weight loss, then maybe err on the side of a lower carb. But if you're athletic and performance based, maybe you have a little bit more leeway there. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that is accurate. And also like just knowing, like for me, as a long distance athlete, like I often will do my runs fasted, because I'm teaching my body to burn fat for fuel. But if I'm doing a really intense run, like if somebody's doing like CrossFit session or something really intense, and your goal is performance, like I need to get out there and kill it, that makes sense to have some sugar, have a banana, have something, maybe more carbohydrate dense before that meal, right? Or before that workout, because then you're going to be able to go hit it really hard. And while I might actually, I may not be burning as much fat for fuel, that's not my goal for that workout, right? My goal is to get after it and kill it, whatever. And certainly if you are having carbohydrates with meals, I always recommend you never want to have like just a carbohydrate. And we do this all the time in America. Like, I'm just going to have a bagel. I'm going to have that's a recipe for a metabolic disaster. Like you want to make sure you're having protein and fat as well.
Yeah, because it kind of blunts your response to the blood sugar increase, right? It's
exactly. It slows down the entrance into the bloodstream.
Cool. So as we're talking about like workouts, how do you fuel yourself for your workouts? Like I hear that you go into workouts fasted. A lot of us do fasted training as well. Can you speak a little bit about like just from your perspective, how to eat as an athlete?
Yeah, and it's really different, as from an endurance athlete to certainly like somebody who's doing a power sport or a faster sport, whatever. But I often, if I'm doing an easy run, if I'm doing something less than a couple hours, I'm usually up pretty early, have some coffee with either heavy cream or coconut oil. And then I'm just, I go. If it's not too hot, it's been pretty mild here, I might just take some water. Sometimes some electrolytes. I like the LMNT, high salt. If I am going really long or I'm practicing for races, then, that's when I'm going to take in some supplemental carbohydrates. And, in my personal opinion, that really needs to be like what settles on your stomach, what you can deal with. And as a low carbohydrate athlete, I found I can go pretty well with about 20 grams of carbohydrates an hour. Back when I was a high carb athlete, it was 40 to 60 grams, so I'm actually able to take in a lot less carbohydrate. So I have a lot less risk of GI because, I'm going to be running 5, 6, 7 hours. So, I don't need my stomach getting nuts. And, certainly before longer runs, you could have, if your stomach can tolerate it, you could have a little bit of fat. Some people, like I said, coconut oil. What else? Generation UCAN is a carbohydrate I've used before. It's a slow burning carbohydrate. Pretty cool story. I actually used to work for them a while ago. Basically, it's a carbohydrate that they use heat, water, and pressure to make it big and branched. So it doesn't cause an insulin response. It breaks down really slowly. So it's like I hooked you up to a glucose drip. It's coming in really slowly. So I've used that before, and that's been really helpful for longer or more intense runs. And yeah, I definitely prioritize when I'm done running. That's when I will definitely have some carbohydrates. Your body's ready to absorb it after that, and protein. Those are two things I prioritize. But I also, it's nice about being on a low carb diet is I don't, when I was a high carb athlete, the second I finished running, I was like, oh, I'm dizzy and shaky. I got to get something. I can get some water. I can stretch. I can go walk my dog. I'm not it's not an emergency. My body's no longer on. I have to eat every 2 hours. Oh my God, I'm this dizzy, shaky person. It's much more balanced,
Yeah. You're not obsessed about eating and timing and things like that, as long as you're getting your nutrition in and you're keeping your blood sugar levels stable by minimizing or moderating your carbohydrates.
Exactly. And that takes some time, especially if you're someone who's coming from a really high carbohydrate way of eating, it takes a minute. But I did, over time, and also just making sure you are getting enough fat. Like you were saying, protein is very satiating. So I know women, especially, it can just be exciting. I had this steak or I had this whatever, and I wasn't hungry all day. Well, you do need to get enough calories. You do need to make sure you're eating, good sources of fat, and whether you want to eat some avocados, those plant-based fats and coconut oil, or, you do butter, cheese, saturated fats. You do need to make sure you're getting enough fat.
Nice. So, I think we've talked about the main things that you probably have to debunk, when you're working with clients or just speaking to people in general. I mean, we talked about, is there anything else in the debunking world that comes up a lot that that might be useful for our people listening today?
Yeah,
We
well,
talked
yeah,
the
I think,
cholesterol, we talked blood sugar.
cholesterol is a big one. Blood sugar is a big one. You don't need to eat every few hours. That's stupid. It's not normal to be in pain, oh, I have abdominal pain, bloating, gas. That's not normal. And then just you already talked about, you had someone on here for regenerative agriculture. So, regeneratively grown, vegetables and regeneratively utilized agriculture is the best thing we can do for the planet, and I also sincerely believe that when we're healthier, happier humans, we're making a better contribution to the planet. So I'm a big advocate for regenerative ag.
Cool. Well, I have a few more questions, and I want to make sure that we have time for you to discuss some things that you have coming up. The first one is kind of a combo question from it's from Alex, Valerie, Lauren, and Kathy, and it's mainly around women. Are there any concerns or recommendations as far as the menstrual cycle, menopause or premenopause, or any considerations around that, as far as maybe animal-based or just nutrition in general?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think for women in general, first of all, 50% of the world is deficient in iron. It's the number one mineral, vitamin, or mineral deficiency worldwide. So I definitely think, we should be prioritizing things that are high in absorbable iron, when we're having our periods, when we are menstruating. And the number one thing that I make sure that I'm eating, is beef liver. I know liver is one of those things that a lot of people don't like, but you can certainly get some good bioavailable iron in just any ruminant animal, beef, lamb, bison. But when it comes to carbohydrates, yeah, I do think, some people can get really zealous and be like, I'm a zero carb, only animal based. And I'm like, I don't believe that's the best way for most women most of the time. I think, especially if you're, around your cycle, I think it's important to get some more glucose, because your body is almost at that point kind of preparing for pregnancy. And even if you don't want to be pregnant, or you're, I don't want to be pregnant. A lot of people notice man, I'm just craving sugar. What's going on? Your body is almost telling you I need a little bit of glucose around this time. So let's say if you're somebody who normally eats, I'm going to just throw an arbitrary number. You're eating animal-based 50 grams of carbs. You might consider the week before your cycle, bumping up your carbs a little bit to, 75, 100 grams through that, and then going back down. For men, interestingly, people after they are no longer having periods, I've noticed they tend to be fine keeping their carbs relatively the same or similar. But if you do notice I'm feeling kind of crappy, it could be something you experiment with. And in my experience, it doesn't need to be dramatic. It's not oh, I was eating 50 grams of carbs, now I need to eat 300. It's just, you might need to eat a couple more servings of fruit or, some type of whole food carbohydrate.
Yeah, didn't you say that you went a pretty significant period of time without having a cycle, and then as soon as you started eating nutrient-dense foods or changing your diet up, went back to normal?
Yeah, well, and I certainly, when I was, I was anorexic when I was 12. I didn't have my first period until I was 19. So that did not help my bone density. And I've had 2 stress fractures, a pretty serious one in college that ended my college running career. But yeah, I went vegetarian for a while, and and this is my experience as a female, and I lost my cycle as well. So then, added animal protein back, and it came back.
So anything in particular around menopause, premenopause, postmenopause, any nutrition dietary recommendations or advice?
Not that I would say are significantly different
beyond what we talked about.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. What about, so digestion? This is also a combo question because several people had asked this. What is the digestive transition like to go from one way of doing things to something that's more animal-based? And specifically, John Hughes had asked, if you're eating, a lot of protein, do you need to support your digestion different or better?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it depends because a lot of people, especially in this country, we take a lot of like Pepsid AC, we take a lot of what are the other ones? I can't think of the names, but things that are designed to lower our stomach acid. It's like, oh, I have heartburn, I have a stomach ache, I got to take Maalox or Tums. And it's like, we need our stomach to be acidic. It's designed to be very acidic to help break down protein. But if you've been taking a lot of, of those things, or if you've been eating a relatively low protein diet, your digestion might be kind of slow or kind of sluggish. Or some people will eat like some red meat and they're just like, oh, it just feels like a lot. So I do think for those individuals, getting just like a digestive enzyme, something that has like the proteases or ox bile in it, can actually help support your system. And I don't necessarily think it's something you need forever, but I found people have some success with that. Mm-hmm. And there's a few other tips and tricks I've heard of. Like some people use like apple cider vinegar or some things. I don't know if there's a whole lot of science behind that, but we do know that the digestive enzymes and the ox bile can actually help increase your body's ability to break down the protein. So that's kind of where I would personally start. Yep. And then also you need to make sure. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, especially if you have like digestive dysfunction, as you're doing, maybe you need some support somewhere, right?
Yeah, it's just kind of like supporting and just keeping it very simple. Like maybe you're like, all right, I'm just going to be eating beef and butter for a couple of days. I mean, I basically had beef and butter for like 30 days, beef, butter, and salt. With I still had coffee. What else is I? Oh, and just making sure you're getting enough fat. Because if you're eating like lean, like, oh, I had chicken, I mean, you're going to be constipated. You're going to, you don't need fiber to poop. You do need enough saturated fat. That is very, very important.
Cool. Awesome. And then, so Suzanne's been in the medical field for a while, and we talked a little bit about your career as an RD, and that happened before you went animal-based. Now that you've been animal-based, do you receive a lot of pushback from your colleagues, or do you feel isolated from them, or are you still a part of that community? Like,
yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Or do you ever run into any issues like maintaining your license while being out there promoting, animal foods and things like that?
Yeah, so when I was an RD, I actually started my animal-based diet when I was still an RD, and every single one of my colleagues thought I was totally nuts. I literally had another dietitian colleague who was obese, morbidly obese, tell me that I was going to die, that my heart was going to stop. And now that I'm in this space, I have dietitians, not as often, but probably at least once a week, send me a mean email or you're giving terrible advice. And what I think if you say something to somebody and they can't give you like a kind response, like I would never say like, well, you're an idiot. My kind response would be like, hey, are you interested in some studies? Can I show you this? Or one thing, like I've asked other dietitians, have you ever gotten somebody off medication? Have you ever got a type 2 diabetic off medication doing a consistent carbohydrate diet? Basically, are you helping people get better? Are you seeing your patients heal? And ultimately, people will either block me on Twitter, or I've had people say like, no, actually, they're not. So often I would get people, it's kind of depending on where they are. Some people are in denial, and, cognitive dissonance is powerful too. Because it's like, what if you're a 90-year-old dietitian and you've been giving terrible advice? Like, I mean, that's kind of hard to wrap your head around. I was giving terrible advice until I knew how terrible the nutrition guidelines were, So yeah. I actually was worried that they would come after my license, but interestingly, the Academy of Nutrition seems, as long as I pay my yearly fee, they don't seem to care what I say. Curious. It's almost like they're more interested in money than actually helping people heal.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it kind of helps if there's a little bit more mainstream buy-in with some of these more animal-based approaches,
Well, now we have really good data with ketogenic diets. It's not just, and we'll have more in the next, we'll definitely have more in the next 5 years. Like there's studies being done right now on animal-based diets, but I'm not, also to answer this person's question, I'm not allowed to practice any longer in the hospital. Like I had to leave the hospital. I did once, while I was still in the hospital, have a diabetic guy super frustrated. And I was like, all right, look, I'm going to tell you what I'm actually doing. And he got really excited and he told his nurse told my boss, and I got suspended. So yeah, now I actually practice as a health coach, basically dash nutritionist. That's how I do my consults, even though, I've got student loans out the wazoo as a registered dietitian. But, it's when you had the health struggles I've had, and when you come out at the other side, it's like, you can't unsee it, and you can't unsee how horrible, like, you don't have to be like, oh, what's a brilliant human, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see how horrible our healthcare system is. Like, we're becoming sicker, more obese, more diabetic. And we're like, it literally is the definition of insanity. Like, just telling people to do the same thing. Our nutrition guidelines are not changed, So yeah.
Well, so several people had asked about like the studies, supporting this, and you've mentioned some. I would say your book is a great resource for that because it's very well cited. And then we'll also reference maybe a couple of other animal-based books as far as research and studies. So, Michelle, I would love to hear what you have going on, how we can connect with you, how we can support you. I know you had some projects that you're working on that you're really excited about.
Yeah. And yeah, thank you for giving me a shout out too. I do have over 188 clinical articles cited in the back of my book. Dr. Paul Saladino has a great, he's got even more in the back of his book. And then Jason Fung, Ben Bickman, Dr. Ken Berry, or, you can just get on Google Scholar and just type in some stuff, even if you can't find the entire article, you might be able to at least get an abstract to kind of get you. So I always tell people like, yeah, go get it, go looking for it. You can find it, yeah. So what I'm doing right now, I've got a few projects in the works right now. I work with clients one-on-one. But also one thing that I'm really, really excited about is, if you follow me on Instagram, my wife and I do short videos. We kind of make fun of traditional dietetics. And I spoke at a conference back in San Diego this past August. And I got this feeling, I said, I don't want to just be an echo chamber. I don't just want to be talking to people who necessarily agree with me, who already bought in. I want to do something, because I feel like in society right now, I'm exhausted with how much talking there is. And I know, obviously I'm here talking, but you hear politicians talk and nothing gets done. You hear doctors talk and nothing gets done.
Empty talk.
Empty talk. I want to see change. I want to see action. Like, isn't that the greatest part of being a human, is like loving each other? Like, when in society did we stop like genuinely caring, like genuinely saying like, I got you, I want to help you. And so I've just finished the first draft of my grant. I've never written a grant before. It took a minute to figure out how to do this. Thank goodness I got a buddy who's done it. It's a process. But anyway, what I want to do is I want to address food insecurity, because unfortunately, let me tell you what I've seen in the healthcare system. Let's say somebody comes into their doctor and maybe they're pre-diabetic or a little overweight. Go in, their doctor says like, oh, you need to eat better. And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? Well, you should just, eat less, move more. Well, doctor, I'm working 2 jobs. I'm super stressed. I'm low income. The doctor's like, well, you should eat better. Like, that's not helpful. I mean, even if you gave somebody a list of foods and said, hey, you should eat, it's like, we're not addressing kind of the root cause here. And so what I want to do is like I said, I'm writing a grant, and I want to do it as a pilot. I want to start with 5 families dealing with food insecurity, because it is my hypothesis that we can't just randomly tell people what to do, right? Like, obviously I'm animal based. I want people we're connecting with local farmers in our area, and I want to every week have a drop, have people have 6 pounds of beef, cheese, butter, eggs, and sausage. And I also am going to teach them the importance of animal protein in the diet, why this is good for you, culturally appropriate recipes. And I'm going to connect with them every week. I'm going to talk to you every week. I'm going to see how you're doing. Because in my experience, when people often don't waste protein, protein is something that ends up in the landfill. We know that statistically about 40% of food waste is produce. So that's what I want to do. I want to get people these animal foods. I want to kind of remove the barriers. Yeah, I'm dropping it right on your door. It's there. I'm giving you culturally appropriate recipes. I'm loving you. I'm helping you. I'm got your back. And I want to see if that improves your health. What does that improve? Because, healthier humans are happier humans. So.
Yeah. So is there going to be, how are we going to get updated on that? Do you have like a newsletter or anything, or do you?
There will be. Well, in the grant, I'm also advocating for some administrative costs, and there would be social media, there would be a website. Certainly on the website, there'd probably be an email list. So the goal of this is to start this, at least by the beginning of next year. But if everything goes well, I should be able to start by the end of this year. It's kind of like I'm kind of a one-man show getting it going, but I also hope to start a model that could be taken to other places. Cause it's like, well, if I can do this in my community, can we recreate this in other communities? And maybe it's not 5 people. Maybe we can do this for 20 people. I'm not sure if I could, just me personally, would be able to do it. But then, am I able to hire somebody else? But I've seen the transformation for people with a few things. And I'll share with you just a brief story because I know I really appreciate y'all's attention. In 2019, kind of around the time I was getting my health back, we had backyard chickens. Me and my wife had chickens. And they were laying a ton of eggs, and we weren't eating, a ton of eggs. So I was like, oh, it'd be really nice if we just gave, a dozen eggs to someone in need. So I got on Craigslist and I put an ad and said, free eggs, would love to give this to someone who maybe doesn't have enough to eat. First of all, in my own zip code, the response I got was sad. Like within 12 hours, I had over a dozen people message me saying, I lost my job. I can use the protein. I would love the extra food. But I ended up that woman said, I'm 80. I'm a widow. I would love the extra protein. I depend on emergency food boxes. So I just dropped it, said, I'm going to drop you a dozen eggs every week. Dropped it, left a note. Next week I go to, drop it, and she leaves me a note. And so long story short, we've been doing this since October 2019, and it's gone from eggs and notes to, she sends me emails. She has a copy of my book. She'll wish me well on my races. And now it's not just egg. We don't have chickens anymore, but it's protein. So that connection is what changes lives too. Obviously her health is improved, and her, having, she eats lots of fish and chicken and other things that I drop for her. But also knowing that somebody cares, knowing that someone's like, hey, how are you doing? Hey, I'm keeping an eye on you. My grandparents have passed. So it's become very special for me. And of course, I went into it thinking like, oh, this is such an altruistic thing for me to do. I'm giving to this person, but it ultimately tenfold came back around to support me.
Yeah. Well, I think that's beautiful. And I love the grant you're applying for, because it sounds like you're removing barriers to accessing food by giving it right to them with a little bit of education. And that's what people need. They need to know a little bit of what to do and a little bit of the why, and then have it there.
I have this hypothesis that processed food companies target people with low income as well. It's like, it just makes me very angry, the marketing and the availability and stuff. So it's like, I'm just trying to fight back in a little way I can.
So Chandler asked, Michelle, do you try to educate medical professionals, on your, what to be true now? And if so, how receptive are they with your nutrition practices?
In the hospital setting, not at all. They were not receptive. I actually, in my book, I saw kind of a scary trend with people on statins, because I worked on a floor called the rehab floor, and rehab not being like drug rehab, but rehab being like, I had a major fall or a burn to where I need to be in the hospital for like a couple of months. Like I'm going to be working with PT or all this. And I saw people come in, and there was this, because when you evaluate someone initially, you're looking at their meds, their weight. And I just saw this really, people that were coming in with strokes. 68% of people had been prescribed a statin within the last 6 months. And I was like, this is terrifying. And so I went to the doctor, the head doctor of that floor, to talk to him. And he was like, yeah, let me know when you have your medical license, like take a hike. Yeah. And so I've also talked to, several traditional doctors, and their nutrition education is just bad, and so most people are not interested. And honestly, I don't even blame them to some degree, because in our healthcare system, most people don't have time. They're just like, I'm so overwhelmed. I gotta go. You have 15 minutes or less with a patient, Yeah. But there is the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners I'm a part of. And there is a whole group of doctors. Dietdoctor.com is run by low carb doctors. They have lots of ketogenic resources on their website. Mm-hmm. So that group is obviously very receptive, but it is my goal to continue to get the word out, because I think, obviously it's exhausting to be a healthcare professional and to see all your patients just keep getting sicker and sicker. So I'm hopeful to talk to anybody who will listen.
Yeah, well, it seems like we got a great grassroots movement going, regardless of what you believe in, whether it's paleo or primal or low carb or animal based. It's this real food movement. It's
Mm-hmm.
gaining traction, and there's a lot of people out there that need help. So I'm really thankful for what it is that you do. Thank you so much for your time today. I just want to recommend anyone who wants to dig, because we could have talked for 3 hours. I mean, I have so many, I have so many other
There's a lot of stuff in there.
I
Yeah.
yeah, I have so many other questions, but again, to be respectful for time, your book was amazing. I think it was the perfect combination of story. Again, I was tearing up in the very beginning, but it's got a lot of how we got to where we are with the nutrition advice that we're, being exposed to the majority of the time, and then you have some really solid recommendations. And again, even though you come across as an animal-based athlete, it was a very compassionate, flexible way of recommending, how to eat and stuff. So I thought it was just an amazing book, and I'd highly recommend anyone watching or listening to get that book. So anything else that we need to say before we get out of
Gosh,
here?
yeah, I just, once again, I appreciate your time, and I appreciate, I really appreciate your approach too, because I think it's very easy to be dogmatic, especially when you've got your health back, like, it's only animal, it's only plant. It's like, for most people, there is some type of balance, obviously I think I personally have had my better health with that, but I do think, like you said, when we can get back to this more real whole foods, just being nice to each other, I think
Yeah.
we're going to see a healthier society. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yep. And embrace animal foods and protein. All right, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum. And yeah, thank you so much for being with us today, Michelle. Really, really appreciate it. Yeah, The
You're
Dietitian's
welcome.
Dilemma was a really good book. Thank you, Chandler, for putting that in there. Yeah.
Cool. Cool. Yeah. And I'm happy to come back anytime.
Okay. We're going to hold you to it. Thank you so much.
Okay.
No, that was great.